"Don't move, Atlas," the billionaire said softly. But the dog didn't listen. His amber eyes were fixed on the tiny girl standing by the service door, trembling, tapping her leg in a strange rhythm. It took Richard Langford only a few seconds to realize something was wrong. The quiet of his private office turned heavy. Atlas's fur bristled, his muscles tightening like cables. The little girl, small, dark-skinned, no more than 6, stood frozen, tears glimmering in her wide eyes. On the floor near her foot, a small metal box had rolled out from under the desk, ticking faintly. Where did that come from? Richard's voice was calm but sharp. He had never seen this child before, not in his house, not in his company. Atlas gave a low growl, moving between Richard and the box. Then, in one quick motion, he lunged forward, grabbed the object with his teeth, and flung it toward the far corner. A flash, then a sharp pop, not enough to destroy, but enough to make the windows tremble. Smoke filled the air, acrid and gray. The fire alarm began to shriek. Atlas stood over his master, his stance protective, while the girl screamed. Richard pulled her close, dropping behind the desk as sprinklers burst open, rain hissing from the ceiling. When the chaos settled, the office was soaked. Papers clung to the floor. Richard's suit was drenched, his heart still hammering. He looked at the girl. She was crying quietly, clutching his sleeve. Atlas remained by the door, chest heaving, eyes locked on the smoking corner. Security stormed in. "Sir, are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Richard said curtly, still catching his breath. He glanced at the half-melted shell of the metal box. "That's not a bomb, it's a data wipe device. Someone tried to destroy my system from the inside." "Sir, who's the child?" "She's the housekeeper's daughter," Richard replied slowly. "I saw her earlier with Mrs. Miles." At the mention of that name, his expression hardened. Gertrude Miles. The head housekeeper, quiet, efficient, loyal for 20 years. Or so he'd believed. Within 20 minutes, the floor was sealed off. Richard sat with the little girl in the medical suite. A thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She was trembling, her eyes swollen from tears. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Anna," she whispered. "I didn't know what was inside. I was told to leave it on your desk." "Told by who?" Her lip quivered. She shook her head and said nothing. Instead, she began tapping lightly on her leg. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, the same rhythm Atlas had reacted to before. The dog, lying near the door, lifted his head. His ears twitched. Then, slowly, deliberately, he tapped one paw on the floor. 3 times. Pause. 3 times. Richard froze. The room went utterly still. "That's a signal," he murmured. "How do you know that pattern?" Anna looked up at him through tears. "My grandpa taught me. He said if I'm scared and can't talk, I should tap like that. He said someone good will hear me." Atlas stood, walked toward her, and pressed his head against her knee. Richard straightened. "Get Mrs. Miles up here," he told security. "Right now." When the door opened, Gertrude Miles entered, drenched from the sprinkler water, her face pale but composed. "Mrs. Miles," Richard said, his voice low, steady, dangerous. "Do you know why your son's name just came back to me?" She blinked, then forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I can't imagine, sir. You had your maid's child bring a device into my office. That's attempted sabotage. Why?" Her mask cracked. "Sabotage?" she repeated softly, then let out a brittle laugh. "You really don't remember, do you? Ethan Miles. You destroyed him." Richard frowned. "Ethan, from the IT department? That was 2 years ago. He caused a data breach. He made a mistake," she snapped. "A small mistake. And you ended his life with 1 email. Fired. Blacklisted. No one would hire him. Do you know where I found him, Mr. Langford? On the floor of our apartment. He was 28 years old." Richard's voice went quiet. "I didn't know he was your son." "No. You didn't know, because you never look at anyone you step on." Her voice trembled now, a blend of rage and grief. "You think your empire makes you untouchable. I wanted you to feel fear for once. To see what it's like to lose control, Atlas growled, stepping between her and the child. Richard's tone hardened. You used a 6-year-old girl. That's not justice. That's cowardice. Gertrude's face twisted. You think I meant to hurt her? No. I wanted the system down. Just the data. But maybe part of me hoped you'd see what pain looks like. You almost killed us both, Richard said coldly. You don't get to decide who deserves to hurt. She lifted her chin. Neither do you. Take her, Richard ordered. 2 guards stepped forward. Gertrude didn't resist. As they led her away, she turned back once, her eyes burning with something deeper than anger. You can lock me up, Mr. Langford, she said, voice breaking. But remember, the only one who heard the warning was that little girl, not you. The door closed. The office fell silent except for the steady drip of water from the ceiling. Richard looked at Anna. She was sitting still, her hands clasped tight, eyes distant. Atlas moved beside her, resting his head on her lap. You did the right thing, Richard said softly. Anna looked up. I just tapped. Grandpa said someone good would hear. Richard nodded slowly. He was right. Atlas shifted his paw 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps as if answering her. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about profit or deadlines. He was thinking about a small signal in the dark, a message from the innocent that had saved his life. Sometimes, he realized, the loudest warnings don't come from voices at all. They come from silence and from those who still know how to listen. If this moment touched your heart, share what you felt in the comments below and tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us to listen even when the world goes quiet. The next morning came heavy and gray, the kind of sky that presses low over Manhattan, turning glass towers into mirrors of fog. Richard Langford hadn't slept. His office, still sealed by security, reeked faintly of smoke and burnt plastic. He stood by the window in a fresh suit, but his eyes looked older. Atlas sat beside him, perfectly still, gaze fixed on the skyline. Down below, cameras flashed. The media had caught the story. Explosion at Langford Tower, child and dog save, billionaire's life. It was everywhere now. Investors called, lawyers called. Everyone wanted answers, but Richard wanted only one thing: to understand how it had come to this. The intercom buzzed. Sir, Detective Morales is here to see you. Send her in. The detective was a woman in her 50s, her expression unreadable. She had the quiet authority of someone who had seen too many crimes and no longer believed in coincidences. Mr. Langford, she began, flipping open her notebook. We've reviewed the footage. The device was planted by the housekeeper's daughter, Anna Carter. She entered your office at approximately 9:13 p.m. But according to the statements, she was acting under the instruction of Mrs. Gertrude Miles. I know, Richard said. The woman admitted as much before she was taken into custody. Admitted to placing the device, yes, but she claims she didn't intend to cause harm. Morales's tone was skeptical. It's hard to prove intent when the device could have easily killed you. Her son, Richard said quietly. He worked here once. I fired him. Morales studied him. Do you believe this was revenge? Yes, Richard said, then paused. But not against me alone. Against the system that made me believe people are replaceable. Morales wrote something down. We're holding Mrs. Miles at the 14th precinct. She's cooperating. The press will want a statement from you. Richard turned toward the window again. They'll get one when the truth is clean. When Morales left, silence returned thick, almost physical. Atlas exhaled, resting his head on his paws. Richard's gaze dropped to the floor where the scorch marks still lingered. The girl's tapping echoed faintly in his memory. 3 short. Pause. 3 short. A child's code. Simple and pure. He couldn't shake the thought that the only person who'd seen the danger clearly had been someone society didn't even see. At noon, his assistant announced that Martha Carter had arrived. Richard's jaw tightened. Let her in. Martha entered, eyes red, holding her daughter's small hand. She looked smaller than he remembered. Shoulders slumped under a worn denim jacket. Anna hid half behind her mother's leg, clutching a stuffed bear missing one ear. "Mr. Langford," Martha began, voice trembling. I wanted to apologize. I didn't know what she was carrying. I would never let my child." "You don't need to apologize," Richard interrupted. "Your daughter saved my life." Martha blinked, confused. "Saved you?" "She gave a signal," he said. "Your daughter is very brave." Anna's small voice broke the silence. "Atlas heard me." The dog's ears flicked at his name. He rose and walked over, tail wagging gently. Anna knelt down, hugging his neck. For a brief moment, Richard saw something soft and fragile, the connection between a frightened child and an animal that had chosen to believe her. "She's been having nightmares," Martha whispered. "She dreams about fire and loud noises. I shouldn't have brought her here that night." Richard shook his head. "You couldn't have known what Gertrude planned." He hesitated, then asked, "Did you know about her son?" Martha's face tightened. "Ethan Miles. Everyone in service did. He was a kind man, quiet. She never recovered after he died." "Did she ever blame me openly?" "Not in words," Martha said carefully. "But she changed. She started talking to herself when cleaning your office. Sometimes she'd look at your photo like it could talk back." "And no one said anything?" "Sir," Martha said gently, "people like us don't talk about people like you. We just keep our heads down." The honesty in her tone hit harder than any insult. Richard looked away, jaw clenched. "I see," he murmured. "You may go home. The company will cover any costs you've had this week." Martha hesitated. "Mr. Langford, I don't know what will happen to Mrs. Miles, but please, she wasn't always this way." She squeezed Anna's shoulder. "She used to sing while she worked. She took pride in serving this place." Richard didn't answer. He only nodded once. When they left, he sat back at his desk, eyes unfocused. Outside, the clouds shifted, letting a sliver of light fall across the city. Atlas moved closer, placing his paw on Richard's shoe, as if to anchor him to the present. "You heard it before I did," Richard whispered. "You knew something was wrong, and I—" He stopped. Admitting weakness out loud felt foreign. But the truth was, he had missed the warning signs in everyone around him, not just in the dog's reaction. That afternoon, the board called an emergency meeting. Faces filled the digital screen, older men in suits, younger executives eager to contain the fallout. "This could damage investor confidence," one of them said. "We need a press release clarifying the incident was isolated." "It wasn't isolated," Richard said. "It came from within." "Exactly," another executive replied quickly. "All the more reason to reassure shareholders." Richard stared at them. "You think this is about shareholders?" Silence. He leaned closer to the camera. "A woman risked everything because she believed we destroyed her son's life without a second thought. That isn't an image problem. That's a moral one." "With respect, sir," the CFO said, "moral problems don't affect quarterly earnings." "Then maybe I've been measuring the wrong kind of profit." He ended the call. The quiet after the meeting felt like oxygen returning to a suffocating room. He loosened his tie and sat in the dim light, watching raindrops race down the window. For the first time in decades, Richard Langford questioned the empire he had built, the hierarchy, the distance, the invisible wall between him and everyone who served him. Later that night, he reviewed the building's surveillance footage himself. He watched Anna walk down the hallway, small and hesitant, clutching the silver box. Gertrude waited in the shadows near the elevator, her face pale, her lips moving as if in prayer. When the girl disappeared into the office, the woman turned away and wiped her eyes. There was pain in that face, not victory. Richard rewound the footage 3 times before stopping at a single frame. Anna looking at Atlas, the moment before the explosion. Even through the grainy pixels, he saw it, the quiet courage, the instinct to reach out, not to harm. He saved the frame. It would remind him of something he had almost forgotten, that innocence often carries the clearest truth. The next morning, his assistant brought news. "Sir, the press is outside again. They're asking about the girl and the dog. Some outlets are calling Atlas a hero." Richard almost smiled. "They're right." He stood, buttoning his coat. "Cancel my morning calls. I'm going to the precinct." "To see Mrs. Miles? To listen," he said simply. As he left the office, Atlas followed without command. The elevator doors closed, and for a brief, suspended moment, the reflection of man and dog merged into one figure, one searching for redemption, the other already knowing what justice sounds like when it doesn't need words. The interrogation room was small, colorless, and humming faintly with fluorescent light. Gertrude Miles sat across from the table, hands folded, wrists free but trembling. She looked smaller than Richard remembered, not the stern, capable woman who once ruled his household staff, but a shadow emptied by grief. When he entered, she didn't lift her head. The officer on duty nodded to him. "You have 10 minutes, Mr. Langford. She's agreed to talk to you privately." Richard sat down opposite her. Atlas waited outside, a quiet silhouette behind the glass wall. For a moment, neither spoke. "You shouldn't have come," Gertrude said finally, her voice rough as gravel. "You have lawyers for this." "I didn't come as a businessman," he replied. "I came as a man who owes you an answer." She laughed once. A short, bitter sound. "An answer doesn't fix the grave." Richard didn't flinch. "You're right, but it's where I have to start." Her eyes, once sharp and proud, met his. "You fired my boy. You signed the email yourself." "I did," Richard said, "because he covered up a data breach. He admitted it." "He admitted to protecting your company," she shot back. "He took the blame for a system error he didn't cause. You needed a scapegoat. He was convenient." Richard hesitated. He remembered the case vaguely. Hundreds of files corrupted, a loss of millions. The name Ethan Miles had been just another line in a report. "He was found in his apartment 3 days after the dismissal," Gertrude continued. "His body was cold by the time I got there. You know what the coroner wrote? Cardiac failure due to stress." She clenched her fists. "Stress, Mr. Langford? That's what killed my son. The kind you caused. If I'd known he was innocent, you wouldn't have cared," she said sharply. "You don't see the people who scrub your floors or fix your servers. We're invisible until something breaks." Richard leaned forward. "Then why involve the child? Why risk Anna?" "Because no one listens to women like me," Gertrude said. "But they listen when something explodes." Her voice cracked, but her eyes stayed fierce. "I only meant to erase the company's files the same way you erased my son's name. I didn't know the device would ignite." Richard's jaw tightened. "You lied to that little girl. You used her kindness. And you used my son's loyalty," she snapped. "We both sinned differently." The words hung between them like smoke. Richard exhaled slowly. "Do you regret it?" "Every breath since," she said quietly. "I loved that child. I thought I was sending a message, not causing terror." She looked away, but when I saw the flames on the news, I knew what I'd become. Richard studied her face, the wrinkles carved deeper by guilt than age. "What happens now?" she asked after a long silence. "Prison? The police will decide that," he said, "but I'll tell them the device wasn't intended to kill." "You'd do that?" "Because I owe Ethan that much," he said softly. "And because your granddaughter, she reminded me that not all debts are financial." Gertrude blinked. "Why are you being kind?" "Because for the first time," he said, "I'm ashamed." He stood, pushing back the chair. "Goodbye, Mrs. Miles." "Mr. Langford?" He paused at the door. "You were right," she said. "About what?" "I used the wrong messenger." Outside, Atlas waited, tail still. Richard knelt beside him. "She's broken, boy," he murmured. "But so was I." Atlas licked his hand once, a quiet acknowledgement. As they left the precinct, the city was already awake, honking, shouting, alive with its indifferent rhythm. Richard walked slower than usual, as if every step weighed something unseen. His driver pulled up, but Richard waved him off. He wanted to walk. The rain had washed the sidewalks clean. Passing by a small newsstand, he caught a glimpse of a headline. Dog saves billionaire from sabotage heroic K9, named Atlas. Beneath it, a smaller caption, housekeeper in custody. Motive: revenge. He bought the paper, folded it, and slipped it into his coat pocket without reading. At home, the mansion felt different. Empty, too quiet. The portraits in the hallway stared down like silent jurors. Martha Carter had returned earlier to pack Anna's belongings. Only the faint scent of lavender polish lingered. Richard went to his study. Atlas followed, curling at his feet. On the desk sat a small box, not metal, but wooden, hand-carved. Inside, Richard had placed the melted remains of the device and a printed still frame from the surveillance video. Anna's tiny hand mid-tap. He studied the image, feeling something stir, not guilt this time, but purpose. He reached for his phone and called his assistant. "Mr. Langford, find out if the Miles family has any surviving relatives. I want Ethan's name cleared in the company record." "Yes, sir." "And the press conference tomorrow?" "We'll have it," he said, voice firm, "but it's not going to be about damage control. It's about responsibility." That night, he couldn't sleep. Around midnight, he wandered to the terrace, looking over the city that had made him rich and hollow in equal measure. The lights pulsed like a heartbeat below. "Maybe she was right," he murmured. Atlas raised his head. "Maybe none of us listen until something breaks." The dog's ears twitched. As if in agreement, a faint sound carried from the street, the rhythmic tapping of construction work in the distance. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. Richard smiled faintly. "Yeah," he whispered. "I hear it now." The next morning, he called the police commissioner personally to arrange Mrs. Miles's transfer to a psychiatric evaluation center instead of prison. It wasn't forgiveness, it was balance. Later, as he prepared his statement for the press, Atlas lay at his side, watching. "What do you think, partner?" Richard asked. "Too late for redemption?" Atlas only blinked, then tapped his paw once on the floor. Richard almost laughed. "Right," he said, "one step at a time." The press conference took place in the atrium of Langford Tower, a cathedral of glass and marble, built to impress investors and intimidate journalists. But today, it felt like a courtroom. Reporters filled every seat, their cameras trained on the podium. Security lined the walls. And at the front of the room sat a single, steady figure, Atlas, lying calmly at Richard's feet, eyes alert. The hero of a story far larger than he could ever understand. The lights flared, and Richard stepped up to the microphone. "Good morning," he began, voice low but steady. "2 nights ago, there was an incident in this building, an act that could have taken lives. But because of the courage of a child and the instincts of a dog, it did not." The room buzzed softly with murmurs and camera shutters. "I've heard the word hero a lot these past 48 hours, he continued. "Atlas deserves that title. So does a little girl named Anna Carter. But the truth is, this isn't a story about heroism, it's a story about blindness, mine." He paused, the silence deepening. "For years, I believed that success was built on efficiency, on replacing the weak links, cutting losses, optimizing every process, including people. In that belief, I became something less than human, a man who measured lives by performance charts." A few journalists looked up sharply. It wasn't the speech they'd expected. "A woman named Gertrude Miles worked for me for 2 decades. Her son, Ethan, was dismissed under my supervision after a system failure. He took his life shortly after. I didn't know. I didn't ask. And that silence, my silence, was the spark that led us here." He looked down briefly at Atlas, then back to the cameras. "Mrs. Miles made a terrible choice. But before we condemn her, we must understand what drove her there, the weight of losing someone to indifference. The audience shifted uneasily. Even the reporters who came for scandal were suddenly listening. That is why, starting today, Richard continued, Langford Industries will establish a foundation in Ethan Miles's name. It will provide legal and mental health assistance to employees and their families. We will also review all termination protocols and restore the dignity we took from those who built this company from the ground up. A hand shot up from the crowd. Mr. Langford, are you admitting liability? Richard met the man's eyes. I'm admitting responsibility. There's a difference. Flashbulbs popped. Atlas raised his head at the noise, calm but alert. And, to the public, Richard's tone softened. I ask only that you remember this. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest warnings, and we must be willing to hear them before the world burns. He stepped back. The applause didn't come immediately, but when it did, it was hesitant, thoughtful, the kind of applause that comes from people who aren't sure whether they're moved or unsettled. Either way, it was real. Afterward, in the private hallway behind the stage, Martha Carter and little Anna waited. Anna wore a yellow dress and clutched her bear. When she saw Atlas, she lit up. Atlas, she cried, running forward. The dog's tail thumped hard against the marble floor. Richard smiled for the first time in days. He's missed you, he said. Martha's eyes shimmered. You didn't have to do all this, sir. The foundation, the speech. I did, Richard replied. It's the first thing I've done that feels right. Anna crouched beside Atlas, whispering something only the dog could hear. When she looked up, her small brow furrowed. Is Mrs. Miles still in trouble? Richard knelt to meet her gaze. She's getting help, he said gently. She was very sad and very angry, but she's safe now. Anna nodded slowly, as if processing the weight of forgiveness in a world that rarely offered it. Grandpa says angry people are just hurt people who ran out of ways to cry, she murmured. Richard felt something shift inside him. Your grandpa's a wise man. He fixes shoes, she said proudly. He says everything broken can be mended if you take your time. Richard smiled faintly. Maybe he's right. Atlas nudged his hand, sensing the emotion. Richard scratched behind the dog's ears, the familiar warmth grounding him. I have something for you, he said. Reaching into his coat pocket, he pulled out a small silver tag engraved with the name Atlas, and beneath it, another name, Anna. You two saved me, he said quietly. You belong together. Anna's eyes widened. Can I really? He's yours on weekends, Richard said with a grin. He still has work to do here, but you'll always be part of his story. The girl threw her arms around Atlas's neck. The dog leaned into her embrace, eyes half closed, perfectly still. Later that evening, after they left, Richard walked alone through the building's upper floor. He paused in front of the memorial plaque already being installed, the Ethan Miles Foundation for Human Dignity. Beneath the name, a quote had been etched at his request. Justice is not balance. It is listening before the silence begins. He ran his fingers across the words, then turned as Atlas approached quietly from behind. Ready to go home, partner? Atlas wagged his tail once. Richard looked out across the city again, not at the towers, but at the people below. He wondered how many stories were hidden inside those windows. How many signals had gone unseen. Tomorrow, he said softly, we start doing this right. Atlas barked once, sharp and certain. And for the first time, Richard didn't hear it as a command or warning. He heard it as agreement. The following week unfolded like a slow thaw after a long storm. The building was quieter now, fewer reporters, fewer whispers in the elevators. But the changes were already rippling through Langford Industries in ways Richard hadn't anticipated. For the first time in 30 years, the billionaire made his own coffee. The staff didn't know how to react at first. The CEO walking into the employee lounge at 7:15 a.m., sleeves rolled, asking where the filters were. It was like seeing a ghost trying to blend in with the living. You don't have to do that, sir, one junior analyst stammered as Richard poured steaming coffee into a chipped mug with the company's old logo. I know, Richard said, taking a sip. That's why I want to. Word spread fast. Some thought he was trying to look humble for the cameras. Others weren't sure what to believe. But over the next few days, something changed. He started spending time on the lower floors, asking engineers about their projects, learning the names of security guards. For the first time in years, people looked at him not with fear but curiosity. Atlas was always beside him, his silent shadow. Employees began leaving treats by the dog's desk. It became a small ritual, a piece of warmth in a building that had long forgotten how to breathe. On Friday, Richard called a quiet meeting in the boardroom. No press, no PR team, just a few senior managers, HR, and a lawyer. "We're reopening the internal review on Ethan Miles," he said. "We'll access the old server logs from 2019. If the breach wasn't his fault, I want the record cleared and his family compensated." The room froze. "Sir," said Elaine Porter, the head of HR, "you understand this could expose the company to liability." Shareholders will survive," Richard interrupted. "A man didn't." There was no argument after that. The silence spoke its own kind of truth. When the meeting ended, Elaine stayed behind. She was in her 60s, calm, the kind of executive who had seen every version of his temper over the decades. "You've changed," she said softly. "Or maybe you've just started remembering what people look like." Richard gave a tired smile. "I forgot that leadership isn't measured by distance." She nodded, eyes warm but sad. "You're a good man when you let yourself be." After she left, Richard lingered by the window overlooking the city. He thought about Gertrude sitting alone in that sterile facility upstate. He thought about Ethan, a young man buried in a file folder. And then he thought of Anna, the girl who'd seen what none of them could. A knock at the door broke his reverie. Martha Carter entered with Anna, who was holding a small paper bag. She wanted to bring something. Martha said apologetically, "We baked cookies for the staff downstairs." Anna stepped forward, holding the bag out. "These are for Atlas," she said solemnly. "Peanut butter ones, no sugar." Atlas's ears perked instantly. Richard chuckled. "You spoil him." "He's a hero," Anna replied. "Heroes get cookies." Richard took the bag and smiled. "So they do." Anna looked around the vast office. "It's cleaner now," she said, glancing up at the tall windows. It used to feel sad. The observation startled him. "Sad?" "Yes," she said simply. "Like the walls were lonely." Richard's throat tightened. Maybe they were. She walked to the edge of the window and pressed her small hand against the glass. "Mom says we can see the river from here. But I can't find it." "You can't always see something just because it's there," he said gently. "Sometimes you have to know where to look." Anna turned, studying him as if weighing that answer. "Like Grandpa's code?" "Exactly like that." Atlas settled beside her, tail brushing her shoes. For a long moment, the three of them stood quietly. Sunlight slanting through the glass in soft gold ribbons. The world outside seemed calmer, almost listening. Later that evening, after they'd gone, Richard returned to his desk and opened an old archive file on his computer. Incident Report March 2019. The logs were raw code, endless lines of time, stamps, and commands. He scrolled for hours, eyes burning, chasing a hunch he couldn't quite explain. Then he found it, a timestamp logged under an external contractor ID. A misconfigured patch upload, not Ethan's login. The real cause. Ethan had taken the blame for someone else's negligence. Richard leaned back, staring at the screen as the truth hit him like a wave. He whispered, he was innocent. Atlas, lying by the window, opened one eye as if he'd heard the words. "You were right again, partner," Richard said softly. He closed the file, then began drafting an email to the company's board. Effective immediately, all disciplinary terminations will be reviewed under the new ethics division, and the family of Ethan Miles will receive full restitution, including benefits owed. He paused, then added a final line. "Some debts cannot be paid with money. But we begin there." The next morning, he drove himself to the small care facility north of the city. The nurse at the desk looked startled when she saw him. Mrs. Miles has been quiet lately, she said gently. You can go in. She's lucid today. Inside, the old woman sat by a window, knitting something pale and soft. She didn't look up. I thought you'd forgotten me, she murmured. I found the truth, Richard said. Ethan didn't cause the breach. It was a contractor error. I'm clearing his record. Her hands froze on the yarn. Slowly, she looked up, eyes glistening. You came all this way to tell me that, to tell you he was right, and that I was wrong. A tear slipped down her cheek. Then maybe my boy can rest now. Maybe we both can, Richard said. He stood quietly for a moment, then added, I also came to ask, would you want to help us run the foundation in his name? Not as a maid, as its heart. She blinked, stunned. You'd trust me with that? I'd trust no one more. Her hands trembled as she nodded slowly. Maybe that's how I can make it right. No, Richard said softly. That's how we both do. Outside the window, the winter wind rattled through bare branches, carrying a faint rhythm, 3 soft beats, a pause. 3 again. Atlas, waiting by the car, lifted his head toward the sound. Winter loosened its grip on the city slowly, like a reluctant apology. By early March, the first hints of spring reached Manhattan thin sunlight. The smell of rain on warm concrete, and the low hum of a city, remembering how to breathe again. Richard Langford stood at the window of the newly renovated Ethan Miles Foundation, its glass doors gleaming below the Langford Tower logo. It had taken weeks of planning, lawyers, and late-night calls, but the foundation was real now, staffed, funded, alive. Inside, volunteers sorted boxes of supplies. Legal advisors held quiet consultations, and, in one corner, Gertrude Miles sat by a window, knitting scarves for veterans who'd come seeking help. She looked stronger. Time and rest had softened the bitterness in her face. When she noticed Richard watching from the upper balcony, she gave a small nod, formal but sincere. He nodded back. There was no forgiveness spoken between them, but there was recognition, and that was enough. Atlas trotted beside him, tail swaying like a metronome of calm. Every employee in the building knew him. Now the dog was both mascot and guardian. A reminder that instinct sometimes saw what intellect missed. Richard had even added a plaque by the lobby's front desk, in honor of Atlas, whose ears heard what eyes could not. As Richard stepped into his office, Martha Carter was waiting with a stack of reports. The press wants to feature the foundation on Sunday, she said. They'll want a photo of you and Mrs. Miles together. Richard grimaced. She hates cameras. Then maybe let them photograph the people she's helping, Martha said with a faint smile. She's been meeting veterans every morning. Half the reason they show up is because she listens better than anyone here. He glanced through the window again. Gertrude was talking to a man in a worn army jacket, his hands shaking slightly as she handed him a cup of coffee. For the first time since Ethan's death, her eyes had light in them. She's found her place, Richard murmured. She always had one, Martha replied softly. She just needed someone to stop looking past her. At that moment, the elevator doors opened, and Anna burst out, holding Atlas's new collar in both hands. Mr. Langford, she shouted, her voice echoing through the hall. Look! The collar was engraved with a small gold plate. Atlas, Listener of Hearts. Richard chuckled. That's quite a title. Mom said it means he listens better than most people. She leaned closer, whispering conspiratorially. Even you. I believe that, he said. Anna crouched and slipped the collar around Atlas's neck. The dog stood proudly, chest out, tail wagging. Then he pressed his nose against her palm, and she laughed a bright, pure sound that filled the room with something cleaner than sunlight. Martha followed behind, shaking her head with amusement. She begged me all week to get it engraved, she said. Said Atlas needed something shiny for being brave. He's earned it, Richard replied. So have both of you. Anna looked up, eyes serious now. Mr. Langford, are bad people always bad? The question stopped him cold. Why do you ask? Because Mom says Mrs. Miles did a bad thing, but you said she's helping people now. So, was she bad or just sad? Richard knelt to her level. Sometimes, Anna. People do terrible things because they're lost. Sad can make people dangerous. But when they find their way back, he glanced toward Gertrude. They can still do good, they can still matter. Anna considered that, then nodded slowly. So, people can change. They can, he said, if they're brave enough to face what they've done. Atlas gave a soft huff, as if agreeing. Later that afternoon, Richard drove north toward the Hudson River. Atlas sat in the passenger seat, head out the window, ears flicking in the breeze. The air smelled of thawing earth and salt. Richard's destination was a modest cemetery outside Yonkers, the resting place of Ethan Miles. He hadn't been back since the investigation closed. He parked beneath a willow tree and walked quietly toward the small granite marker. Ethan Miles. 1990. 2019. Beloved son. Gone too soon. Someone had left fresh flowers. He knew it was Gertrude. Richard knelt beside the grave, resting his hand on the cool stone. Ethan, he said softly, I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know the truth came out. Your mother's safe. She's helping people again. And the company finally remembers your name. Atlas lay down beside him, head resting on his paws. The wind rustled through the willow leaves, soft, rhythmic, almost like tapping. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. Richard smiled faintly. You hear that, boy? Even the wind knows the code now. They stayed there for a long time, watching the sunlight fade. When he finally rose, he felt lighter, not absolved, but anchored. That night, back in the city, Richard attended a small staff dinner for the Foundation's volunteers. The dining hall was filled with laughter, the clinking of cutlery, the kind of warmth that money couldn't buy. Gertrude gave a short speech, hesitant, but honest. We can't undo what's been done, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But we can choose what comes after. Kindness doesn't erase guilt, it balances it. When she finished, the room fell silent before a wave of quiet applause rolled through. Richard watched her, deeply moved. After dinner, he stepped outside with Atlas. The streets were slick from a passing rain, the neon lights shimmering on puddles. We've come a long way, haven't we? He said. The dog pressed against his leg, warm and steady. Maybe the hardest part isn't asking for forgiveness, Richard murmured. Maybe it's believing we deserve it. Atlas lifted his head, amber eyes gleaming in the streetlight. He gave one short bark, a sound that felt almost like agreement. Richard smiled. Yeah, partner, one day at a time. As they walked home under the quiet drizzle, the rhythm of their steps matched the familiar pattern that had changed everything. 3 soft beats, a pause, 3 more. Spring deepened quickly, painting the city in colors that felt almost new. The Ethan Miles Foundation was thriving now. The press stories had faded, the public had moved on. But inside those glass walls, something real had taken root. People came seeking help, not pity. Veterans, single parents, workers who'd lost their jobs unfairly, they all found quiet dignity within those halls. And in the middle of it all, Richard Langford moved differently now. Slower, humbler. He still wore tailored suits, but he stopped hiding behind them. He shook hands. He listened. He learned. That morning, a staff meeting filled the second-floor conference room. Richard stood at the head of the long oak table, Atlas lying at his side, tail flicking every few minutes. The team was reviewing a new mentorship program pairing retired professionals with laid-off workers. This is the kind of bridge we should have built years ago, Richard said. Let's make sure it's not just paperwork. People need to feel they're seen. Gertrude, sitting near the end of the table, nodded thoughtfully. We can start with families like mine, she said. Ones who lost someone because no one cared to ask a second question. There was a quiet murmur of agreement around the table. Martha Carter scribbled notes beside her, her focus sharp but warm. If we can turn those stories into training sessions, maybe the company world will listen a little more. Then let's do it, Richard said. I don't want this foundation to just bear Ethan's name. I want it to reflect what he should have been allowed to become. After the meeting, as staff filtered out, Gertrude lingered. You're changing the right things, she said softly. But don't forget, Guilt can be a heavy tool. It builds fast but cracks easy. He gave her a tired smile. You sound like my conscience. I was a mother long before I was a maid. She replied. And mothers don't stop teaching. Even when no one's listening. That afternoon, Richard took a call from his attorney about a potential lawsuit, a former executive threatening to leak internal emails from the 2019 data breach case. He's saying you're rewriting history, the lawyer warned. Maybe I am, Richard said, but this time I'm writing it right. The lawyer sighed. You're making enemies, Richard. Big ones. I've had worse, he said, hanging up. Outside, Atlas barked once, sharp and alert. A soft knock followed almost immediately. When the door opened, Anna peeked in, grinning. Hi, Mr. Langford. Mom said you forgot lunch again. She held up a brown paper bag. Turkey sandwich. No mustard. You don't like mustard. Richard laughed, shaking his head. You have spies in the kitchen now? Just Atlas, she said proudly. He told me. He smiled and took the bag. You two make a good team. Can I see Mrs. Miles? Anna asked suddenly. She promised to teach me how to knit. She's in the library downstairs, Richard said. Be gentle, she pretends she's tough. But she's soft inside. Anna's grin widened. Like Atlas? Exactly like Atlas. When she ran off, Richard sat for a moment, staring at the sandwich untouched on his desk. It struck him how strange and beautiful it was that the same child who once brought danger into his life was now the only one who could make his world feel steady. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, Richard wandered through the foundation alone. The hum of cleaning machines echoed down the marble corridors. He found Gertrude in the library, helping Anna wind yarn around her small fingers. The two of them looked up and smiled. We're making scarves for the shelter, Gertrude said. Anna's got a good hand for it. Richard leaned against the doorway, watching them. The room was bathed in the orange light of dusk, soft and forgiving. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. Then his phone vibrated. A message from the lawyer. The former executive leaked the emails to the press. He opened the article link. The headline glared. Langford Industries covered up data breach. Billionaire's foundation under fire. His stomach tightened. The story twisted the facts, claiming the foundation was a publicity stunt. That Ethan Miles had been fired for cause. That the CEO was manipulating a tragedy for image. He exhaled slowly, closing the phone. Gertrude noticed the shift in his expression. Bad news? He nodded. They're trying to turn Ethan's story against us. Her hands tightened on the yarn. Let them try. Truth is slower, but it lasts longer. Richard looked at her, this woman who once hated him enough to destroy him, now defending the legacy they had built together. We'll weather it, he said. That night, the headlines spread like wildfire. By morning, TV hosts were debating his sincerity. Journalists dissecting his motives. But as chaos swirled outside, the foundation's doors stayed open. Volunteers showed up anyway. Clients kept their appointments. And in the lobby, Atlas sat proudly in front of the plaque, watching each person who entered as if measuring their heart. When Richard arrived, the staff greeted him with quiet nods. No one panicked. No one left. He called an impromptu meeting. They'll drag our names through mud, he said. But they can't change what we've done. So we'll keep showing up. Every single day. Gertrude smiled faintly. Sounds like redemption with a schedule. Something like that, Richard said. Martha raised her coffee cup. To the ones who listen before the silence begins. The room echoed her toast softly, sincere. Later that evening, as Richard and Atlas walked out of the building into the golden dusk, the sound of traffic and voices filled the street. Somewhere behind them, Anna's laughter floated out through the open windows, high, bright, and alive. Richard paused, looking up at the city skyline glowing in the sunset. They can say what they want, he murmured. But we'll keep tapping, won't we, boy? Atlas gave a quiet, certain bark, 3 soft beats. A pause, then 3 more. The next week tested everything they'd built. Headlines screamed from every newsstand. Billionaire's redemption, a PR illusion. Langford Foundation faces scandal. Ethan Miles, hero or cover story. The networks ran opinion pieces for days. Commentators dissected every word of Richard's speech, every photo of Atlas beside him. Overnight, the line between sincerity and manipulation blurred and the world seemed eager to believe the worst. Inside the foundation, phones rang non-stop. Donations paused. Sponsors hesitated. But the doors stayed open. Richard refused to hide. Every morning, he showed up early, same routine, rolled up sleeves, black coffee, Atlas padding beside him like a living metronome of calm. The staff followed his lead. The quiet defiance became its own kind of protest. On Wednesday, Martha Carter entered his office with a grim expression. "The City Ethics Board is opening an investigation," she said. "They want to know if the foundation's funding was used to shield your company." Richard didn't flinch. "Let them dig. We've got nothing to hide." She hesitated. "Gertrude wants to talk to the press. She thinks it's time someone else tells the story." He turned sharply. "She doesn't have to defend me." "She's not defending you," Martha said softly. "She's defending her son." He leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "If she wants to speak, she should. But make sure she's ready. The press will tear her apart." "She's tougher than you think," Martha said. That afternoon, the foundation's modest press room filled with reporters again. Gertrude Miles sat at a small table, wearing a simple gray dress, her hands steady. Richard stood at the back with Atlas, out of the spotlight. "I asked to speak today," Gertrude began, voice low but firm, "not as an employee, not as a victim, and not as a mother who lost her son, but as someone who caused pain and now sees what came of it." She paused. The room was silent. "I did something terrible. I let grief blind me. I almost destroyed the life of a man I blamed for everything. But that man..." She glanced toward Richard. "He didn't seek revenge. He sought to make things right, not through excuses, but through action." A murmur rippled through the room. "This foundation," she continued, "is not a stunt. It's built on the memory of my son, and on the lesson that justice isn't about punishment. It's about listening before someone breaks." Her voice trembled slightly. "The world loves to point fingers. But sometimes, the real crime isn't what we do, it's what we ignore." When she finished, a long silence filled the room. Then, unexpectedly, the first applause came from one of the cameramen. Others followed. It wasn't loud, but it was real. Afterward, outside in the courtyard, Richard found her sitting alone on a bench. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. She looked up at him, tired but peaceful. "I did. Ethan deserved truth. And maybe you deserved the chance to keep it." Atlas sat beside her, resting his head gently against her knee. She smiled faintly and scratched behind his ear. "He reminds me of my boy. Always sensed when someone was hurting." Richard looked at her for a long moment. "If the world still doubts us, we'll keep building until they can't." She nodded. "Just remember, Richard, the louder the noise, the more important it is to stay quiet inside." The following day, the foundation's inbox flooded with messages not from critics, but from ordinary people. Letters from veterans, single mothers, laid-off workers, all saying the same thing. "We believe in what you're doing. Don't stop." Martha printed some and left them on Richard's desk. He read each one slowly, his chest tightening at every signature. That evening, he took Atlas for a walk through Central Park. The city had softened after sunset, the chaos distant now. He sat on a bench under the bare trees, Atlas at his feet. Across the pond, the skyline glowed proud, cold, and beautiful. He thought about the investigation, the lies, the noise. But he also thought about Anna's laughter, Gertrude's strength, Martha's loyalty, all the invisible people who'd carried him when he didn't deserve it. A man approached from the path, tall, early 40s, holding a worn messenger bag. "Mr. Langford?" he asked cautiously. "Yes, my name's Robert Quinn. I worked under Ethan Miles back in 2019. I saw your interview, thought you'd want to know something." He unzipped the bag and pulled out an old flash drive. "These are the original server logs. Ethan told me to back them up, said one day someone might need the truth." Richard stared, pulse quickening. You're sure? Positive, Quinn said. I left the company right after the breach. Couldn't watch them bury him under lies. Richard took the drive with trembling fingers. Why bring it to me now? Because you listened, Quinn said simply. Nobody ever did before. He left without another word. Richard sat in silence, staring at the small drive glinting in his palm. Atlas nudged his hand gently, sensing the gravity. We're not done yet, are we? He murmured. The dog gave a soft huff, not fear, but readiness. Later that night, back at the office, Richard plugged the flash drive into his computer. Lines of code filled the screen, evidence that the data breach had been triggered remotely, from a rival firm's proxy server. Ethan hadn't failed. He had tried to stop it. He had been the hero all along. Richard's throat closed. He whispered, "You saved us, Ethan." And no one saw it. "Lo," Atlas whined softly, pressing his head against Richard's knee. The next morning, the truth would break the story wide open, not as scandal, but as vindication. But for that one quiet night, sitting alone under the hum of the city lights, Richard finally felt something he hadn't known in years. Peace not from victory, but from understanding. Morning came with the heavy calm that follows a storm, not silence, but a waiting kind of quiet. The world was holding its breath. At 6:45 a.m., Richard Langford sat in his study, the flash drive still plugged into his laptop. The monitor glowed in the dim light, filled with lines of digital evidence, IP addresses, timestamps, encrypted messages. Proof, undeniable and clean. Proof that Ethan Miles had not only been innocent, but had tried to stop the breach that cost him his life. He scrolled slowly, rereading the final entries, Ethan's last digital footprint before the system went dark. The boy had flagged the intrusion, tried to reroute the attack, and sent a single internal alert that was never opened. The timestamp was 3:16 a.m., 5 minutes before the servers collapsed. Richard leaned back, staring at that small, blinking cursor like it was a heartbeat. "You tried to save us," he whispered, "and I let them bury you for it." Atlas stirred at his feet, yawning softly before laying his chin back down. Outside, the city began to wake, the distant growl of buses, the metallic pulse of traffic lights shifting. The day of reckoning had arrived. By 8 o'clock, the Foundation's conference room was full. Martha sat beside Gertrude, her face pale but steady. A handful of journalists had been invited, only the ones Richard trusted to handle the truth without twisting it into spectacle. The rest would have to wait. Richard stepped forward. "Last night," he began, "a former employee came forward with a backup of the original 2019 server logs. What we found confirms that Ethan Miles was not responsible for the breach. In fact, he was the first to detect it and died trying to contain it." A murmur spread across the room. Cameras clicked softly. Richard continued. "The breach originated from a proxy, registered under a rival subsidiary. Ethan's final action was to reroute the attack code away from the company's main server, saving millions in data loss. That effort, the one we blamed him for, was what protected us." He turned slightly, looking toward Gertrude. "We can't give him his life back, but we can give him his name. Today, I've instructed Langford Industries board to issue a formal exoneration, a public apology, and to fund a permanent cybersecurity scholarship in his name." Gertrude's lips trembled. Tears fell silently down her face. "He always wanted to build something good," she said softly. Now he finally did. Reporters began firing questions about accountability, restitution, legacy, but Richard's answers were calm, unwavering. For once, he wasn't speaking to protect himself. He was speaking to finish something that should have been done years ago. After the press cleared out, Martha entered his office carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You realize," she said, "this story's going to turn the tide. You just burned every bridge with the old board." Richard took a slow sip, then smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's time to build new ones." "Careful," she said, half teasing. "You're starting to sound idealistic again." "I think I just remembered why I started all this," he replied. By noon, every major outlet was running the headline. Ethan Miles cleared. Langford releases. Evidence of heroic actions. The narrative shifted overnight. Commentators who had mocked him now spoke of redemption, accountability, courage. For the first time, public opinion felt like something earned, not engineered. That evening, the foundation held a small memorial in the courtyard. Candles flickered in the early dusk, a soft sea of light. Richard spoke briefly, then stepped aside to let Gertrude take the center. "My son was not perfect," she said, voice raw but clear. "He made mistakes, but he never stopped trying to make things right. That's what this place is about, not saints, but people who keep trying, even when the world stops listening." She paused, eyes glancing toward Atlas lying near the fountain, head resting on his paws. "And sometimes, when we don't have the words, something pure still hears us. A heartbeat, a gesture, a tap on the floor, something that reminds the world we're still here." The wind stirred gently. Someone began to hum, "Amazing Grace." The song spread quietly, one voice becoming many. Anna, sitting on the edge of the fountain with her mother, hummed too small, off-key, but sincere. After the ceremony, as people lingered under the warm glow of lanterns, Richard sat beside Gertrude on a bench. Neither spoke for a while. The sound of the fountain filled the space between them. "Funny," she said finally. "For years I hated this building. Now it feels like home." He nodded, maybe because it's finally doing what it was meant to do. Gertrude smiled faintly. "You ever think Ethan forgives you?" Richard thought for a long time before answering. "I think forgiveness is less about him letting go, and more about me holding on to what he taught me. Even in the worst moments, he still did the right thing. That's how I'll remember him." Atlas stood, stretched, and pressed his nose into Gertrude's hand. She chuckled softly, tears returning. "He always knows when to comfort someone, doesn't he?" "He's the better half of this operation," Richard said. She laughed quietly. "Maybe he's the only one who never stopped believing people could be good." When the courtyard emptied, Richard lingered by the fountain with Atlas. The water shimmered with candlelight, and he could almost see reflections of everything they'd lost and everything they'd reclaimed. "Funny, isn't it?" he murmured to Atlas. "The smallest hands, the quietest codes, the people nobody noticed, they're the ones who saved us." Atlas leaned against his leg, warm and solid. Above them, the city lights blinked like signals in the dark. 3 quick flashes. A pause. 3 again. Winter crept back into New York with a quiet vengeance, wind scraping against glass. Nights that fell too early. Mornings that came too slow. The foundation's courtyard, once alive with flowers and light, now stood under a soft gray blanket of frost. Inside, however, the hum of work never stopped. The Ethan Miles Foundation had survived the storm, but new challenges had begun to form in its shadow. Richard sat in his office, staring at the quarterly report. Numbers, always the language he understood best, now felt heavier, more human. The foundation's funding was steady but strained. Donations covered the programs, but not expansion. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's ironic," he muttered. "Doing the right thing costs twice as much as ignoring it." Atlas lifted his head from beside the desk, tail thumping once in mild agreement. A knock came at the door. Martha stepped in, holding a manila envelope. "You've got mail," she said. "The old-fashioned kind." He looked up. "Bills?" "Not this time," she replied, handing it over. "It's from the state attorney's office." Richard tore it open. Inside was a single sheet, a notice of recognition. The Ethan Miles Foundation was to receive the Governor's Humanitarian Award for exceptional contributions to ethical reform and worker dignity. He blinked. "That's unexpected," Martha smiled faintly. "Apparently, even politicians appreciate redemption stories when they're well written." He set the letter down, exhaling a quiet laugh. "Maybe they just want to borrow some goodwill." "Doesn't matter," she said. "Take it. You earned it." But as soon as she left, his expression darkened again. The truth was, recognition didn't solve the growing tension beneath the surface. Gertrude had been growing distant, quieter in meetings, avoiding cameras, and worse, he had started noticing strange inconsistencies in the foundation's financial logs. Small transfers, anonymous donations, all tied to a company name he recognized from the breach files, the rival firm that had orchestrated Ethan's downfall years ago. At first, he thought it coincidence. But as the pattern repeated, his instincts sharpened. Someone was funding the foundation from the shadows, and it wasn't charity. It was infiltration. That night, long after everyone had gone, Richard called Martha back to the office. The city outside was a fog of white snow and orange light. "I need you to look at something," he said, turning his monitor toward her. "These deposits all routed through shell accounts. The trail ends with a firm called Weiler Systems." Martha frowned. "That's the same group that framed Ethan, isn't it?" "Exactly," he said. "They're back, and they've been donating under aliases for months." She stared at the screen. "What do they want?" He leaned back, his jaw tightening. "Influence. Access. Maybe they think I'll let them rewrite the story, turn this place into a PR shield. And if you don't, they'll bury us again." Atlas gave a low, uneasy growl, as if sensing the tension. "We need to tell Gertrude," Martha said. "Not yet," Richard replied. "She's been through too much. I'll find out who's behind it first." The next morning, Richard drove to the city archives, searching for connections between Weiler Systems and old Langford board members. Hours passed in silence, pages flipping, coffee cooling, and then there it was, a name that froze him. Thomas Vance, former board member, former head of acquisitions, fired 5 years ago for insider trading and recently reinstated at Weiler. He sat back, eyes narrowing. Vance. The same man who had pushed for Ethan's dismissal. The same one who had championed cutting redundant staff to protect investor interests. "Of course," Richard murmured. "He's rewriting the narrative from the other side now." When he returned to the foundation that evening, the lobby lights were dim. Only one figure remained: Gertrude, sitting quietly near the plaque, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up as he approached. "You've been out all day," she said. "Digging up ghosts," he replied. "Find any?" He hesitated. "More than I wanted to." She studied his face for a moment. "You think I don't know something's wrong?" He sighed. "Weiler Systems is behind a string of donations. I traced them to Thomas Vance." Gertrude went still. "That man," she whispered. "He came to my house once. Years ago. After Ethan's death. Said he was sorry. Said he'd handle everything. I thought he was being kind." Richard's stomach turned. He wasn't being kind. He was covering his tracks. She looked away, her voice trembling. "And now he's coming back to bury him again." Richard nodded. "Unless we stop him first." For a long moment, neither spoke. The hum of the heating vents filled the silence. Then Gertrude reached down, resting her hand on Atlas's head. "You're not going to let him win this time," she said softly. "No," Richard replied. "This time we tell the story before they can twist it." Later that night, as snow drifted past the glass walls, he drafted a letter, open, public, and unflinching. It detailed every donation, every hidden tie, every attempt to manipulate Ethan's legacy. He ended it with a single line: "You cannot buy redemption. You earn it, one act of truth at a time." He hit send just before midnight. When the statement went live, the internet caught fire again, but this time, not with outrage, with admiration. Journalists called it the most transparent act of corporate accountability in recent memory. Martha texted him 3 words before dawn. "You did right." Richard looked out at the first light of morning breaking through the city fog. Atlas pressed against his leg, warm and steady. "We're not done, are we, boy?" he whispered. Atlas lifted his head and gave one deep, deliberate bark, the sound of a soldier answering roll call. The fallout came fast. By mid-morning, Richard's letter had gone viral. The Foundation's inbox overflowed with messages, half gratitude, half fury. Transparency, it turned out, was a double-edged sword. For every person who praised his honesty, another accused him of hypocrisy. Some said he was trying to play the martyr. Others demanded that he step down entirely. Martha entered his office, phone buzzing in her hand. "They want a statement," she said. "Every network's calling. CNN, MSNBC, even Fox. They're framing this as a war between you and Weiler Systems." Richard leaned back in his chair, exhaustion creeping behind his eyes. Then let them call it that. Maybe it's time someone fought one. Atlas paced near the window, tail twitching, ears alert. The tension in the room was electric. Martha hesitated. You know Vance isn't just going to sit back. He has lawyers, investors, friends in every corner of the city. If he wants to crush you, he'll try, Richard interrupted. But he'll have to do it in daylight now. Just then, the door opened. Gertrude stepped in, her face pale, eyes hard. She held a folded letter in her hand. He already started. Richard frowned. What is that? A subpoena, she said flatly. Vance filed for defamation. He's suing you and me for damages. The room went still. Martha swore softly under her breath. Richard rose slowly from his chair. He's not after money, he said. He's after silence. Gertrude's voice trembled, but her spine stayed straight. He won't get it. Not again. He looked at her, really looked at her. The woman who had once nearly destroyed his life now stood beside him like a soldier who'd found her battlefield. Then we fight together, he said. For the next 3 days, the foundation became a war room. Lawyers cycled in and out. PR consultants offered advice Richard refused to take. Martha ran communications, drafting careful responses while fielding hundreds of interview requests. Atlas, sensing the storm, never left Richard's side. By the 4th day, the pressure hit its peak. The governor's office, the same one that had planned to honor the foundation, called to postpone the award ceremony. Privately, the message was clearer. Distance yourself from controversy or risk losing funding. That night, Richard met with his board. The conference room buzzed with fear. We can't afford to antagonize Weiler, one member argued. They're too powerful. Drop the lawsuit. Apologize publicly. Say it was a misunderstanding. Richard's jaw clenched. A misunderstanding? You admitted to defaming a man with deep political ties, another said. If you keep pushing, we'll lose everything, the foundation, the programs, the staff. Richard looked around the table. Every face he saw carried the same mix of fear and fatigue. And for a moment, he understood it. But fear was what had buried Ethan once. He wouldn't let it happen again. Then we'll rebuild without your money, he said quietly. If integrity costs everything, I'll pay it. There was stunned silence. Then one board member stood, the youngest, a woman named Leah Ortiz. You're right, she said. He's counting on our fear. Let's make him regret it. One by one, others followed her lead. A few left, but enough stayed to matter. By morning, the foundation issued another public statement. We stand by the truth, no matter the cost. The city split overnight. Some donors fled. Others sent double their usual support. But the biggest shock came 3 days later when a file was anonymously delivered to the foundation's inbox. Inside were internal Weiler communications, emails, contracts, even a voice memo from Thomas Vance himself. It was damning. In one clip, Vance bragged to a partner about repurposing the foundation's goodwill to soften Weiler's image before their upcoming merger. In another, he mocked the Miles case, calling it a convenient sob story. When Richard finished reading, his hands were trembling. He recorded himself. He whispered. Martha leaned over his shoulder. People like that always think they're untouchable. Not anymore, he said. That evening, he forwarded the files to the Attorney General's office with a short message. For Ethan Miles. For everyone who stayed silent too long. Within 24 hours, the story broke across every major outlet. Leaked recordings expose Weiler Systems cover. Up. CO under investigation. Vance was finished. Arrested 2 days later on charges of fraud, obstruction, and corporate espionage. The foundation's staff erupted into cheers when the news aired. Even Atlas barked, tail whipping against the floor. Gertrude cried quietly in the corner, hand over her mouth. But Richard didn't celebrate. He just stood at the window, watching the snow swirl outside. It's over, Martha said gently. He shook his head. No, it's never over. Justice doesn't erase the pain. It just gives it a place to rest. That night, when the building emptied, he sat alone in the quiet. The plaque glimmered under the hallway light. Justice is not balance. It is listening before the silence begins. Atlas walked over and pressed his head into Richard's lap. Richard smiled faintly. We heard them this time, didn't we, boy? Atlas gave a soft, contented sigh. Outside, the city was blanketed in snow. For the first time in a long while, it felt like peace, fragile, fleeting, but real. The trial began in early March, when the last of winter still clung to the edges of the city. Snowmelt pooled in gutters, taxis hissed through the wet streets, and television crews crowded the steps of the Manhattan courthouse. The people versus Thomas Vance. The scandal that had begun as a whisper now carried the weight of a reckoning. Richard Langford walked up those steps in a dark wool coat, Atlas padding beside him, the picture of calm authority. Behind them came Gertrude, her face pale but steady, and Martha, clutching a folder filled with months of evidence. The cameras flashed wildly. Mr. Langford, do you expect to testify? Is it true you leaked the files yourself? Are you seeking revenge? Richard ignored them all. Revenge wasn't the goal. It never had been. Inside, the courtroom was hushed, the kind of silence that feels alive. Vance sat at the defense table, still polished, still smiling the empty smile of a man who thought money could rewrite gravity. His lawyers whispered around him like bodyguards. When the proceedings began, the prosecutor wasted no time. Recordings of Vance's voice played through the speakers, his arrogance echoing through the room. We'll let Langford's foundation carry the guilt while we rebuild the empire, one clip said. People love a redemption arc until you take it away from them. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Gertrude gripped the edge of the bench so hard her knuckles went white. Vance barely flinched. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering something that made the man's jaw tighten. Then it was Richard's turn. The bailiff called his name, and he took the stand. The air shifted. Cameras clicked from the press box. Pencils hovered over notepads. The prosecutor's questions were simple at first: how he'd met Vance, what led to Ethan's firing, how the foundation began. But when they asked why he risked his reputation to expose Viler, his voice took on a quiet strength. Because, he said, the truth isn't self-cleaning. If you don't fight for it, someone else writes it for you. He glanced toward Gertrude. A boy died because I didn't listen. A woman nearly destroyed her life because no one believed her grief could be reason, not madness. I wasn't going to let that happen again, not to anyone. Vance's lawyer rose for cross-examination. So you admit you acted emotionally? Out of guilt. I acted, Richard said evenly, because silence is also a crime. The courtroom stirred. Even the judge paused, studying him. When Gertrude took the stand next, her testimony was raw, unpolished, painfully real. She spoke of losing Ethan, of the lies she'd been fed, of how she'd turned her rage into a weapon. She spoke of Richard's forgiveness not as absolution, but as a chance to start again. At one point, her voice broke. He gave my boy's name back, she said softly. And that's something money can't counterfeit. When she stepped down, the courtroom was silent except for the faint sound of Atlas shifting near Richard's feet. His chain clicking softly like punctuation to a truth finally spoken aloud. After 3 long weeks, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty. On all counts. The courtroom erupted. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and Vance was led away in handcuffs, his smirk finally gone. Outside, snowflakes drifted down like confetti. Martha hugged Gertrude tightly. It's over, she whispered. But Gertrude shook her head. No, she said. It's just begun. Richard watched the courthouse steps empty. The victory felt different than he expected, quieter, heavier, but clean. Atlas nudged his hand, sensing the shift. Yeah, Richard murmured, looking out over the crowd. It's never really over. That evening, the foundation's courtyard filled with light. Staff, friends, even former critics gathered to celebrate. Children ran between the candles. Music played softly, a mix of jazz and old gospel, Gertrude's choice. Anna danced with Atlas, her laughter cutting through the night air. When the speeches ended, Richard stepped up to the small stage. His voice carried easily, calm and warm. "Tonight isn't about victory," he said. "It's about remembrance for a man who stood for truth, even when it cost him everything, and for the people who chose to listen when it mattered most." He looked down at Anna, still twirling near the fountain, "and for the next generation who'll inherit a world where maybe, just maybe, we'll hear the quiet ones before it's too late." The crowd applauded, not the loud, performative kind, but the slow, heartfelt rhythm of people who'd lived the story, not just watched it. Later, as the guests began to leave, Gertrude stood beside him at the edge of the courtyard. The candles reflected in her eyes. "You ever think Ethan's here tonight?" she asked softly. Richard smiled faintly. "I don't think he ever left." She nodded. "You did right by him." "We did," he corrected. A gust of wind blew out the last candle. The courtyard fell into gentle darkness, lit only by the faint glow from the windows above. Atlas lifted his head, watching the stars between the clouds. Richard looked up too, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We heard you, Ethan. We finally heard you." The months that followed the trial changed everything, not with fireworks, but with the slow, steady kind of change that builds real foundations. The headlines faded, the anger cooled, and what was left behind felt strangely clean. The Ethan Miles Foundation had survived, and now it was growing into something larger than any of them had imagined. Spring sunlight spilled through the atrium's tall windows, turning the marble floor golden. The lobby buzzed softly with visitors' families seeking help, young professionals volunteering on weekends, retired veterans mentoring new trainees. The world outside was still hard, still unfair. But here, in this space, people felt seen again. Richard stood on the mezzanine level, looking down at it all. He had started to age in visible ways, streaks of gray along his temples, deeper lines around his eyes, but there was a steadiness about him now that hadn't been there before. Atlas sat at his heel, posture regal as ever, watching the ebb and flow of people below like a silent sentinel. Martha joined him, holding a clipboard and a coffee that smelled like heaven. "The governor's office called again," she said. "They want you to speak at the ethics summit next month." He gave a wry smile. "I think I've filled my quota of speeches for one lifetime. They said it would mean a lot to the advocacy groups," she pressed. "And honestly, you'd be good for it. You talk like a man who's seen both sides." He looked down again, thoughtful. "I'll do it," he said finally. "But only if Gertrude's on the stage with me." Martha smiled. "Already told them that." Down in the lobby, Anna came running in from the courtyard, her curls bouncing, clutching a piece of paper. "Mr. Langford," she called, "look what I drew." He crouched as she reached him, Atlas immediately leaning down to sniff the paper. The drawing was crude but heartfelt, a big brown dog beside a man in a suit, with a smaller stick figure in a yellow dress, holding both their hands. Above it, in uneven letters, she had written, "The good people found the truth." Richard felt something sting behind his eyes. "That's beautiful, Anna," he said softly. "You'll have to frame it for us." She grinned. "Mom says I should give it to you. She says you helped fix the world a little bit." He smiled. "Just a corner of it, maybe." Atlas barked once, as if agreeing. Later that day, Richard visited the small memorial garden they had built behind the foundation, a quiet square of stone paths and magnolia trees, with a single bronze plaque at its center. It read, "Ethan Miles, he saw what others chose not to." Gertrude was there, kneeling by the flowers, her hands brushing soil from her palms. "I thought he'd like magnolias," she said without turning. "Strong roots, soft blossoms, a little like him." "Oh, he'd have liked that," Richard said quietly. They stood in silence for a while, listening to the faint hum of the city beyond the fence. Finally, Gertrude spoke again. "Do you ever miss who you were before all this?" He considered that for a moment. "I think I miss the simplicity," he admitted. "But not the blindness." She nodded. "Funny how pain clears your vision." He looked up at the trees. "Maybe that's what redemption really is, seeing things clearly and still choosing to stay." Gertrude smiled faintly. "Then I guess we're both redeemed." A few weeks later, the Ethics Summit took place at the Lincoln Center, a gathering of leaders, activists, and journalists. When Richard stepped on stage beside Gertrude, the crowd fell into an almost reverent hush. The same man who had once symbolized corporate coldness now stood for something harder to define, a kind of moral endurance. He didn't read from notes. He spoke from the heart. "Most of us think justice is a verdict," he said, "but it's not. It's the act of listening even when what you hear breaks you. I used to believe loyalty meant silence. Now I know it means standing beside the truth when no one else will." Gertrude took his hand. "And forgiveness," she added, "isn't pretending it didn't happen. It's choosing to build something better because it did." The audience rose to their feet. Cameras flashed. But Richard barely noticed. What mattered wasn't the applause. It was the quiet tears in the eyes of people who'd lived through their own battles, the janitor who'd lost a son, the veteran who'd been forgotten, the mother clutching her daughter's hand in the second row. That night, after the summit, Richard and Atlas walked through the empty plaza outside. The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement. Atlas trotted ahead, ears pricked, tail swinging gently. "Not bad for two old dogs, huh?" Richard said with a chuckle. Atlas turned his head, tongue lolling, as if smiling back. For a moment, the air felt alive with echoes: Ethan's courage, Anna's laughter, Gertrude's forgiveness, all the small signals that had somehow found their way into one steady rhythm. Richard reached down, brushing his hand over Atlas's head. "We heard them," he murmured. "Every single one." Atlas barked once low, certain, like punctuation at the end of a prayer. Summer came to New York in a burst of heat and color, washing the city in gold and noise. The Ethan Miles Foundation had become a name people spoke with respect, now quietly, sometimes reverently. For the first time in years, Richard Langford felt like he was no longer fighting to prove something. He was simply building. The morning sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, turning the glass walls into mirrors. Outside, the city roared, the endless hum of traffic, the laughter of street vendors, the rise and fall of a place that never really slept. Inside, Atlas lay stretched across the cool marble floor, his breathing slow and steady. Martha stood in the doorway holding a folder. "Good news or bad news first?" Richard smiled faintly. "I'll take the bad. City Council just cut our grant proposal by 30%. They say our public perception's fine now, so we don't need as much sympathy funding." Their words, not mine. He sighed. "And the good news?" She grinned. "We got a letter from the White House. They want you and Gertrude to consult on the new ethics initiative for corporate responsibility." He blinked. "That's unexpected." "It's real," she said. "Apparently, the president's advisor heard your speech at the Ethics Summit and called you a voice that bridges humanity and accountability." He chuckled. "A voice? I can barely get my own board to listen." Martha stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You've changed things, Richard. More than you think." Before he could respond, Anna's laughter echoed from the hallway. She came running in, wearing a small blue volunteer badge that looked oversized on her 6-year-old chest. "Mr. Langford, Mrs. Miles says I can help at the food drive." Richard knelt, smiling. "That's very brave of you." I'm not brave," she said, shaking her head. "Atlas is. I'm just his helper." Atlas thumped his tail once against the floor. "You're both heroes," Richard said softly, "just different kinds." Later that afternoon, the courtyard filled with volunteers packing food boxes for veterans and their families. It was hot, the air buzzing with cicadas. But nobody complained. Anna handed out bottles of water, occasionally stopping to pet Atlas, who wandered among the workers like a four-legged foreman. Gertrude sat beneath a shade umbrella, overseeing logistics with her usual quiet authority. She looked healthier now, less haunted, more grounded. When Richard approached, she smiled. "The kid's a natural leader," she said, nodding toward Anna. "Give her 10 years, she'll be running this place. She's already got better instincts than I did at 45, he said. Gertrude chuckled, then her tone softened. "You ever wonder what Ethan would think, seeing all this?" Richard followed her gaze. I think he'd be proud. Not just of us, of you. You turned grief into something that saves people. She looked down at her hands. Maybe. But it was never just grief. It was guilt, too. He nodded. We all built this place out of guilt. The trick is we turned it into grace. As the sun dipped lower, music drifted across the courtyard, an old Motown tune someone had queued up on the speakers. People laughed, sang along. Martha danced with one of the older volunteers, her laughter echoing across the garden. For a moment, it felt almost like a family reunion. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Richard noticed a man standing at the edge of the gate, watching. He was dressed plainly jeans. A faded jacket, but something about his stillness drew attention. Atlas noticed too. His ears pricked forward. A low rumble forming in his chest, not fear, not aggression, but alertness. Richard straightened. Stay with Anna, he told Martha quietly, and walked toward the man. Can I help you? The stranger met his eyes. Mr. Langford. My name's Daniel Vance. Richard froze. Vance? The man nodded slowly. Thomas Vance was my father. Atlas stepped forward slightly, muscles tensing. The noise of the courtyard seemed to fade into the background. Daniel's voice was low, careful. I'm not here to defend him. I just wanted to see the place he tried to destroy. My father spent his last months obsessed with you with this foundation. Said you'd stolen something from him. He hesitated. I think maybe he meant redemption. Richard studied him. The man's face carried faint traces of his father's features. But the eyes were different, tired, remorseful, searching. You came here for closure, Richard said quietly. Daniel nodded. I came here to say I'm sorry. For him. For everything. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Richard extended his hand. Apology accepted, he said simply. No child should have to carry their parents' sins. Daniel exhaled shakily and shook his hand. Thank you. I didn't expect that. Gertrude had been watching from a distance. As the man turned to leave, she walked over and stopped him gently. You tell your father's story right, she said. Not the version with power and greed, the one where people finally learn to listen. He nodded again, eyes glassy, and walked away into the evening light. When he was gone, Richard turned to her. You think forgiveness ever really ends? She smiled faintly. It's like grief. You don't finish it. You learn to live beside it. Atlas nudged her hand, then leaned against Richard's leg. Together, they watched the last rays of sunlight fade over the courtyard, the place that had once been built from tragedy, now blooming with life. In the distance, Anna's laughter rang out again, clear and bright. Richard looked down at Atlas. We did all right, didn't we, boy? Atlas's tail thumped twice in answer. Autumn came softly that year, the kind that painted the city in gold and amber before the winds turned sharp. The foundation had entered a new phase, steady, self-sustaining. No longer a headline or a symbol of scandal. It had simply become good work, being done quietly. And that, Richard thought, was how justice should live. Quietly, he stood by the window of his office one crisp October morning, coffee in hand, watching the trees shed their leaves along the avenue. Below, volunteers were loading boxes into trucks, food, school supplies, medical kits. The foundation now partnered with community centers across 3 states. What had begun as an act of redemption was now something far greater, a network of people choosing decency every single day. Atlas stretched beside his desk, ears twitching. You've got that look again, Martha said, stepping into the office with her usual half-smile. The one that says you're about to turn a peaceful morning into a moral crusade. Richard laughed softly. Just thinking how far we've come. Far enough to rest a little, maybe? She teased. He shook his head. You ever notice how the moment things get comfortable, the universe reminds you there's more work to do? Before she could answer, the intercom buzzed. Mr. Langford, the receptionist's voice said. There's someone here asking for you. A woman named Evelyn Miles. Richard's hand stilled around his mug. Miles? He looked up sharply at Martha. That name sound familiar? Her eyes widened. Ethan's sister. A few minutes later, Evelyn Miles entered the office. She was in her early 30s, slim, composed, carrying a worn leather satchel that had clearly seen better years. Her eyes, gray like her brother's in the photo that hung in the lobby, held both gentleness and fire. "Miss Miles," Richard said, rising to greet her. "It's an honor." She shook his hand firmly. "You don't know me, but you've been part of my life for a long time," she said. "I've followed everything you've done for Ethan, for my mother, for this city." He gestured for her to sit. "Your brother changed more lives than he ever knew." She smiled faintly, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small flash drive. "He changed mine too. I found this last month, in a box of his old things. It's personal." Richard hesitated. "Personal?" She nodded. "It's a recording, a voice note he made the night of the breach." For a moment, the room felt smaller. Even Atlas lifted his head, as if sensing the gravity. "Would you like me to play it?" she asked softly. He swallowed. "Please." Evelyn connected the drive to her tablet. A moment of static filled the air. Then Ethan's voice, young, steady, calm, with a trace of fatigue. "If anyone ever hears this, it means I didn't make it through the night. Mom, if you're listening, I'm sorry. I tried to fix it. The system's compromised, but I can still reroute it. Maybe someone will understand what I did, maybe not. But if they ever do, tell them it wasn't about saving a company. It was about doing the right thing, even when nobody's watching." Silence followed. Martha turned away, eyes shining. Evelyn pressed her lips together, holding back a tremor. "He must have recorded it minutes before everything went down," she whispered. Richard leaned back, voice barely audible. He knew exactly what he was walking into. "Yes," Evelyn said, "and he still did it." She looked around the office, the photographs on the wall, the foundation's plaque, the quiet hum of the place built in her brother's name. "He'd be proud of you," she said. "All of you." Richard's voice thickened. "I think he'd tell us to stop thanking him and get back to work." Evelyn smiled through her tears. "Then maybe we both knew him well." Later that afternoon, after she left, Richard uploaded Ethan's message to the Foundation's website. No press release, no announcement, just a single post titled, "The Voice That Started It All." Within hours, the clip went viral. People all over the country shared it, students, veterans, CEOs, single parents writing about what it meant to them to do the right thing when no one's watching. That evening, Richard walked through the courtyard. Lanterns glowed along the path, swaying in the cool breeze. Atlas trotted beside him, tail brushing his leg. He stopped at the memorial plaque again, staring at Ethan's name under the soft light. "You still teaching us, kid?" he murmured. Even now, Gertrude joined him quietly, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I heard the recording," she said. "That voice. I almost forgot how young he was." Richard nodded. "He sounded like someone twice his age." "He was always like that," she said softly. "Old soul. Too old, maybe." "Huh." They stood in silence, sipping coffee, listening to the faint hum of the city beyond the walls. After a while, Gertrude said, "You realize what you've built, don't you?" He smiled faintly. "A foundation?" She shook her head. "A promise that good people don't vanish. They leave echoes." Atlas let out a low, contented rumble, settling at their feet. Richard looked up at the night sky, the first autumn stars glinting faintly through the city haze. "Then I guess we just keep listening for them." Winter returned, crisp and unforgiving. The kind that made the city sound quieter than usual. The holidays had passed. The lights came down, and New York wore its gray coat again. But inside the Ethan Miles Foundation, warmth lingered. The walls were covered in children's drawings, volunteer photos, and thank you letters from families who had found their footing again. Richard sat in his office early one morning, the world outside still dark. Atlas lay near the radiator, breathing slow, content. A soft knock broke the silence. "Come in," Richard said. It was Anna, now 7, taller, her curls tied in a loose braid. She was holding a tray with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. Mom says you forget breakfast, she announced. Again. He smiled. She's not wrong. She climbed onto the chair opposite him, swinging her legs. Mrs. Miles says we're starting something new. A school for people who don't have one. She says you have to help because you know how to make buildings. He chuckled. That's true. What do you think we should call it? Anna thought for a moment, eyes bright. The Listening School, she said proudly. Because of the words on the wall, listening before the silence begins. Richard froze for a moment. That's perfect, Anna. She grinned. Can Atlas come? He's good at listening too. Atlas wagged his tail as if answering. Later that day, the idea became official. The Listening School would offer after-hours tutoring, mentorship, and emotional counseling for children of struggling workers. Gertrude wept quietly when she heard the name. Ethan would have loved that, she whispered. In the weeks that followed, plans took shape. Martha handled logistics, Richard coordinated donors, and Anna, now unofficially the foundation's youngest ambassador, created flyers with crayons. The school would open in the spring, right across from the main foundation building, but not everyone supported it. Late one evening, while Richard reviewed construction bids, Martha stormed into his office holding a letter. You need to see this. He read it once, then twice. A corporate group investors from the old Langford Industries board were threatening to withdraw their financial support. They claimed the new project overextended resources and blurred the foundation's focus. In truth, it was fear. The Listening School wasn't just charity, it was reform. It threatened people who profited from silence. Richard rubbed his temples. Of course, the moment you build something honest, someone calls it a liability. Martha crossed her arms. What do we do? He looked up. We build it anyway. The next week, construction began. Volunteers showed up with gloves and tool belts. Teachers offered to donate time. Local veterans provided security. Every day the noise of drills and hammers echoed through the block. The city press called it Langford's Folly. Richard ignored them. One afternoon, while walking through the nearly finished classrooms, Richard found Anna sitting cross-legged on the floor, drawing on the chalkboard. She was sketching a big dog with a child beside it. That's you and Atlas, she said proudly. He smiled. You think we belong on the wall? She nodded. Because you both saved people. And because you listen. Something about her tone made his throat tighten. That evening, as he locked up, he noticed Gertrude standing by the entrance, watching the workmen pack up for the night. The winter light caught her silver hair. You should rest, he said gently. She smiled faintly. I will. But I wanted to see it with my own eyes. The school. The kids. It's like Ethan's voice found a new home. Richard followed her gaze to the half-painted sign above the door. The Listening School, for those who were never heard. He'd be proud, he said. Gertrude turned to him, her expression soft. And you, Richard? You ever stop long enough to be proud of yourself? He looked at the sign, then at Atlas sitting obediently by the steps. I'm proud of them, he said. All of them. I just got lucky enough to be standing close when they made things right. Gertrude laughed softly. You still can't take a compliment. Old habits die hard. When she left, Richard lingered outside in the cold, breath visible in the air. The city around him pulsed with life-distant sirens, car horns, laughter from the corner diner. Yet standing there, beside the glowing sign, everything felt still. He crouched beside Atlas, scratching the dog behind the ears. We built something real, didn't we, boy? Atlas's eyes gleamed in the streetlight. He gave a low, affirming bark. A gust of wind rattled the construction tarp above them. The sound came in a rhythm, 3 soft flaps, a pause. 3 again. Richard smiled faintly. You hear that? He whispered. He's still talking to us. The next morning, snow began to fall again, soft, deliberate, as if the city itself was taking a breath. The Listening School would open in a week. And for the first time in years, Richard Langford woke with no fear in his chest. Only purpose. The grand opening of the Listening School arrived beneath a sky the color of polished steel. Snow dusted the streets, melting on contact with the crowd's warm breath. People from every walk of life gathered along the sidewalk. Teachers, veterans, reporters, mothers holding their children's hands. For once, the press wasn't there to expose scandal. They were there to witness something new being born. Richard stood at the front gate, wrapped in a charcoal coat, Atlas sitting tall beside him. Gertrude was next to him, a simple scarf around her neck, her face calm but her eyes shining. Martha moved through the crowd like a conductor, keeping everything flowing smoothly. Anna, wearing a bright yellow coat, held a pair of scissors nearly as big as her forearm. "I'm ready," she whispered fiercely. Richard smiled down at her. "Then you get the honor." The mayor stepped forward to give a short speech. But the moment he finished, all eyes went to the small girl and the massive dog standing beside her. Anna raised the scissors, looked up at Richard, then at Atlas. The dog gave a single quiet bark, as if giving permission. The ribbon fell, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Inside, the school was small but filled with light. Classrooms painted in soft blues and greens, walls covered in children's art, desks donated by local carpenters. The smell of fresh paint mingled with cinnamon cookies from the kitchen, where volunteers were already brewing coffee for guests. Gertrude leaned on her cane, whispering, "It feels alive." "Richard," he nodded, "because it is." Anna ran ahead, showing people the reading corner stacked with donated books. On one shelf sat a small bronze plaque. For Ethan Miles, who listened first. The first class began that afternoon, 10 children, ages 6 to 12, sitting in a circle with 2 teachers and a counselor. Some were shy, some restless, but the room carried a warmth beyond words. Through the glass wall, Richard watched silently, hands in his pockets. Atlas sat beside him, eyes following every small movement inside. "She's doing fine," Richard murmured. Atlas gave a soft huff, as if agreeing. The counselor, a gentle woman named Mrs. Cooper, began with a question. "What does listening mean to you?" One boy raised his hand. "It means not just hearing. It means caring." Anna added, "It means waiting long enough for someone to finish being scared." Mrs. Cooper blinked back tears. "That's exactly right." Richard turned away before emotion overtook him. Gertrude was standing near the window, watching too. "She's wiser than her years," she said softly. "She's seen more than most adults ever should." That evening, after the last guests left, Richard stayed behind to lock up. The classrooms were quiet now, only the faint hum of the heater and Atlas's soft breathing filling the space. He walked through the halls slowly, touching the door frames, the desks, the small handmade posters. "Speak kindly, listen deeply." In one corner of the reading room, he found Anna asleep in a beanbag chair, her head resting against a picture book about heroes. Atlas lay nearby, one paw draped protectively across her feet. Richard crouched beside them, smiling. "You two make quite the team," he whispered. Martha appeared in the doorway. "She wouldn't go home," she said softly. "Said she wanted to make sure the school didn't get lonely its first night." He chuckled. "She's got your stubborn streak." Martha crossed her arms, mock offended. "Excuse me?" He grinned. "Compliment." As he turned off the lights one by one, he thought about how strange redemption looked. It wasn't grand. It wasn't loud. It was a sleepy child in a beanbag chair, a faithful dog keeping watch, a handful of people refusing to let darkness have the last word. Outside, the snow was falling harder now. Richard stood on the steps with Atlas, looking out over the quiet street. The world was still a mess: wars, corruption, injustice, but here, in this one corner of it, something right had taken root. Gertrude joined him, adjusting her coat. "You ever think about what comes next?" Richard nodded slowly. "All the time. But maybe what comes next is just more of this. More listening. More light." She smiled. Ethan would have liked that answer. Atlas gave a soft bark, as if to seal the moment. As they left, Richard looked back one last time. The lights from the school glowed through the snow, casting a gentle halo over the courtyard. It looked almost like a lighthouse in the dark. A place built not on power or guilt, but on the simple, stubborn belief that compassion could still win. He whispered into the cold night, "Good work, kid." The wind carried his words away. But in the stillness, he could have sworn he heard an echo, 3 faint taps, a pause, and 3 again. Spring arrived like a quiet promise. The city thawed, the air softened, and tulips bloomed along the steps of the listening school. Months had passed since the grand opening. But the work hadn't slowed. Children came and went, carrying stories heavier than their small shoulders should bear, and yet each one left a little lighter. Richard had begun to spend most of his days there, not as a donor or a public figure, but as a man who fixed chairs, helped kids with their reading, and sometimes just listened. Atlas was a constant presence, half mascot, half guardian angel, known to all as the Big Listener. One Wednesday afternoon, Richard found himself standing at the back of a classroom, watching Anna read aloud. She stumbled a bit on the bigger words, but her confidence grew with every sentence. "The hero didn't have a sword," she read, "just a heart that didn't quit." The teacher smiled. "That's beautiful, Anna. What do you think that means?" Anna looked thoughtful. "It means being brave isn't about fighting. It's about not running away." Richard felt a warmth spread through his chest. She didn't know it, but those were nearly the same words Ethan Miles had once written in an old journal found after his death. After class, Anna ran up to him, grinning. "Mr. Langford, did I do good?" He crouched to her level. "You did great. You reminded all of us what courage sounds like." Atlas barked once, as if in agreement, his tail sweeping the floor. Later that week, the foundation hosted a reunion. Volunteers, donors, teachers, and the very first families who had been helped years ago. The courtyard was strung with lights, laughter echoing against the brick walls. Music played softly, old Motown again, the kind Ethan loved. Gertrude was the first to speak. Her voice carried a steadiness that hushed the crowd. "We built this place from loss," she said. "But what keeps it alive is love. Not the kind that fades when things get hard, the kind that digs in and stays." Martha followed, thanking the staff and volunteers. Then it was Richard's turn. He stepped forward to the small podium, hands clasped loosely before him. "I used to believe redemption was something you earned," he began. "That it was a transaction you suffer, you atone, and you get your soul back." He paused, looking over the crowd. Familiar faces, tearful smiles, children clinging to their parents' legs. But that's not it. Redemption isn't earned, it's shared. It's the hand you reach for, the person who forgives you, the courage of a child who reminds you that the smallest act of truth can change everything. He looked down at Anna, who was sitting cross-legged near Atlas, listening intently. "This school," he said softly, "exists because one little girl refused to give up her voice. She reminded us all that justice isn't a courtroom, it's a heartbeat." The crowd rose in applause. Anna blushed and hid her face against Atlas's neck. The dog wagged his tail proudly. Afterward, as the evening cooled, Richard stepped away from the crowd. He walked toward the small garden where the magnolias were beginning to bloom. He felt the years in his bones, but also a deep, quiet strength he hadn't known in decades. Gertrude joined him. "You ever think about retiring?" she asked. He smiled. "Every other Thursday." She laughed softly. "And what stops you?" He looked toward the courtyard, where Anna was chasing Atlas in circles, her laughter floating in the air. "That," he said simply. Gertrude nodded. "Then I suppose we both found our peace." "Not peace," he corrected gently. "Purpose." A silence settled between them, comfortable, earned. As the night deepened, the last guests began to leave. Anna finally slowed down, breathless and happy, sitting beside Atlas beneath the magnolia tree. Richard joined her. "Do you think Ethan can see us?" she asked suddenly. He looked up at the sky, where the first stars were appearing. "I don't know," he said. "But I think he'd be proud of what you've done." Anna smiled sleepily. "I didn't do much. You listened," Richard said. "And sometimes, that's everything." Atlas lay down beside them, resting his head on Anna's lap. The sound of the city faded, the sirens, the chatter, the endless rush, until only the soft rustle of the trees remained. "Good boy," Anna whispered, stroking Atlas's fur. "Good listener." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, letting the peace settle deep in his chest. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed low and steady, the same rhythm that had once carried a soldier's code through time. 3 taps, a pause, 3 more. He smiled faintly. "You hear that, Atlas?" he murmured. "They're still sending the signal." The dog's ears flicked, and his tail brushed softly against the ground in answer. The morning of the Foundation's 10th anniversary dawned clear and bright, the kind of morning that made New York feel almost gentle. The city outside was the same, restless, loud, full of motion, but inside the listening school, time seemed to slow. Every hallway was decorated with drawings, each one a story: a child and a dog, a woman planting trees, a group of people holding hands beneath a wide blue sky. Richard arrived early, as he always did. He wasn't wearing his usual tailored suit, just an old navy jacket and a smile that came easier these days. His hair had gone mostly gray. His hands carried the fine tremors of age, but his eyes, steady, kind, searching, were still the same. Atlas walked beside him, slower now, his muzzle silvered, his movements deliberate. Age had come for both of them, but neither seemed to mind. Martha was already in the lobby, fussing over last-minute details. "They're setting up the live stream," she said. "You'll have the governor, 2 senators, and half the city watching. No pressure." He grinned. "You know, I stopped caring about pressure years ago." She laughed, soft and fond. "That's the problem. You stopped caring about everything but this place." "Then I did something right," he said simply. The guests began to arrive: families, old volunteers, new faces who had only ever known the listening school as part of their lives. Gertrude entered with help from a young teacher. Her hair snow-white now, but her spirit unbowed. When she saw Richard, she smiled, tears already glimmering. "You old fool," she said warmly. "You actually built a miracle." "Not alone," he said, taking her hands. "Never alone." As the ceremony began, Richard stepped up to the small outdoor podium. The courtyard was full, sunlight spilling across the magnolia trees. Atlas lay at his feet, panting quietly, his eyes on the crowd. 10 years ago," Richard began, "I stood in this very spot and didn't know what to say. I thought redemption was something you had to earn. I thought guilt was a punishment you carried forever, but I was wrong. Guilt can be a teacher. Redemption can be shared." He looked out at the faces before him: Anna sitting proudly with her mother in the front row, Gertrude beside them, Martha watching from the back. "This school began with a signal," he said softly, a rhythm only one listener could hear. "It started with fear and ended with faith. And that faith, it built everything you see here." He paused, voice low. "Sometimes I still hear it. The tapping. 3 beats. A pause, 3 again. It's not just a code anymore, it's a promise. To listen when others can't, to act when others won't, to keep believing that good can still win." The crowd was silent for a long moment, many wiping tears. Then, from somewhere near the front, Anna stood, her voice, clear and bright, carried across the courtyard. "It does win, Mr. Langford." Richard smiled. "Yes, Anna, it does." Applause rose, long and steady, washing over him. That evening, after everyone had gone, the courtyard lay quiet again. The string lights glowed softly, the magnolia blossoms catching the light like tiny lanterns. Richard sat on the stone bench near the plaque that bore Ethan Miles's name. Atlas rested beside him, breathing shallow but peaceful. "You did well, old friend," Richard murmured, scratching behind his ears. "You kept every promise we ever made." The dog gave a faint wag of his tail, his head lowering onto Richard's knee. The city hummed in the distance. But here, everything was still. After a while, Richard spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know, sometimes I wonder if all this started because a little girl dared to hope a stranger would listen. Maybe that's all the world ever needs, a signal and someone willing to hear it." Atlas shifted slightly, pressing closer. The old man leaned back, eyes tracing the stars above the courtyard. He could almost hear Ethan's voice, the laughter of volunteers, the echo of children's feet running through the halls. A life rebuilt, not from wealth or power, but from listening, forgiving, and staying. In the quiet, a soft rhythm began, the wind brushing against a loose window pane. 3 gentle taps. A pause. 3 again. Richard smiled. "Yeah," he whispered. "I hear you." He closed his eyes, resting a hand on Atlas's fur. The magnolia petals drifted down like snow, blanketing the ground. When Martha found them an hour later, the two were still side by side, man and dog, peace etched into their faces. The lights flickered above them, the faint sound of the city pulsing beyond the walls, and though neither of them spoke again, those who came after swore they could feel something in that courtyard, a hum beneath the silence, a presence that seemed to say, "Keep listening." Years later, the listening school grew into a national network, but in its heart, nothing changed. Every classroom, every volunteer shift, every small act of kindness carried the same unspoken rhythm. 3 taps. A pause. 3 again. A code that meant, "I'm here. I hear you. You're not alone." The story reminds us that true justice isn't always delivered in courtrooms or headlines. It's found in the quiet moments when someone chooses to listen, to act, and to care. It teaches that redemption isn't earned through power or wealth, but through humility, compassion, and the courage to do what's right even when no one is watching. Through Richard, Anna, and Atlas, we learn that a single act of empathy can ripple through generations, that sometimes all the world needs to change is one small signal and one heart willing to hear it.